Hi, you're listening to the Christian and the Campus podcast, and I am lucky to be here with Mac Matthews and Matt Mills. I could introduce them for you, but since they're here with me, I'll let them introduce themselves, and we'll put age before beauty and let Mac go first.
Well, I thought I had both categories hands down, but I'll take that. A lot of M's to deal with today. But I'm Mac Matthews, 50, almost 56 years old, and I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've been sober for almost 29 years. February 18th will be my 29th sobriety birthday, and I work a lot of different jobs in Auburn, Alabama, and one of the most important ones is building relationships with college students through our campus ministry. So that's me.
And my name is Matt Mills. I guess I can list my age too. I'm 39. Been a campus minister for 15 years now. I'm preaching at a small church in Perkins, Oklahoma. Coming at addiction, primarily trying to help students overcome pornography and lust, and even dealing with that personally. And then coming at it from a clinical side, have a master's in marriage and family therapy and in Christian ministry. So kind of coming at addiction through that angle for me.
Yeah, I'm super glad that both of these guys and men and mentors have agreed to be part of this conversation, because I don't think I really have to list a set of numbers to explain to people that, this is an issue. This is something that is very prevalent on a college campus, and this set of podcasts that are coming out over the holiday break are all about things we encounter on a college campus, and addiction is certainly one of them. And so as we start this conversation about addiction, the question I just want to kind of ask you guys, and y'all can come at it from whatever perspective you feel is necessary, is this, and that is, what is addiction, and what does it look like specifically in the life of a college student?
That's an incredibly important question. Until we get the terminology down, it's really important. And again, mine's more of a personal experience, and I really value Matt's perspective because he carries a more of the clinical side of things, which is very, very important. But, for me, addiction is whenever there's something going on in your life where it's bad for you, but you seem powerless to not continue in it. And it's that simple.
So,
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's such an important topic to look at, and describing it more in a clinical way. To me, it's simply when we activate a reward response in our brain, and our body is sort of adjusting to the feeling of having that reward met or appeared to be met over and over. And as Max said, demanding more and more. Often we see it when we look at diagnosing people. We don't often talk about it as a addiction as much as a pattern of intoxication and withdrawal. And that pattern just cycles over and over. And then, you might say, well, when do I know that I am an addict or struggle with addiction? And it's really when it begins to impair your life, your daily functioning. Others will probably let you know that too.
If they're aware, because one of the common themes too is these things tend to start, unless you're dealing with something that's that's viewed as not socially acceptable from the beginning. These things tend to begin in public, and then they move to the private sphere. One of the key indicators for me that somebody's really deep into that well is when I talk to a college student who's got an issue with drinking, and they express that, and I ask them, how often are you drinking alone? And when it's gone, private, when it's hidden, that's when you're really deep down in that gravity well, and it's gonna require a lot to get out of it. And so, that addresses the second part to some degree of what does it look like in the life of a college student? These things tend to start innocently enough, especially on the college scene, because you have so much more access to so many things that are viewed as a normal part of a college existence. And so a lot of times you see those things begin, um, although within Christian circles, you see a lot of people try to hide that stuff from the beginning. But they start simple and then it goes deep and goes private.
Mm-hmm. Matt, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna mention how a key indicator for me is when a student is expending lots of energy trying to obtain it or trying to keep it under wraps, and that energy that's expended makes them so exhausted in every other area. And so that's really when, if a lot of times when the minister notices it's already too late, but that's a sign for me, is that expending of energy trying to obtain your drug or your coping mechanism of choice.
Yeah, we've had previous conversations before this one that we were recording, and Mac used language with what do you medicate, right? We all medicate with something. And do you want to unpack some of that before we move forward, maybe?
Yeah, it's it's kind of dangerous language. It's got to be contextualized a bit, but as we dive into why do so many people deal with a variety of addictions, it's you can throw out the statement that everybody medicates. We all have moments in life where we're facing things that we really don't want to deal with, or we're missing something that we really want. And so we find a way to make ourselves feel better. You think about medicine, it's supposed to make you feel better. It's supposed to fix something that's wrong, or heal something that's broken. But addictions go the other way. And we talk about medicating. It's not a positive term. A lot of it's avoidance. And so, when and perhaps that's really valuable for an audience that's listening to this, where they don't struggle with addiction or think that they don't struggle with addiction. You've got to create some empathy. And when we stop and think about what kind of things we choose to medicate with, whether it's relationships, you're just never going to be alone. So you don't have to deal with things, or to step on some toes of all the coffee snobs out there. If you ask a few people to go without their coffee for a couple of days, trouble. And so, we all medicate. It's just it's a question of really the intent and the actions that follow it. And Matt's, touched on that several times.
So just kind of introducing yourselves, we've kind of hit too, I think, of the more kind of big ticket items in terms of with what we medicate with, what addictions are kind of really prevalent on a college campus with alcohol is a fairly common addiction, I think, on a college campus, and pornography, especially among males. Though very well can be among females, and that number is actually larger than kind of popular opinion seems to think. And so beyond those kind of big ticket items, right, we just are trying to help students think about and kind of maybe name addiction in their life, and maybe see it for the first time, that they are medicating with something. What are some other addictions that you've seen amongst out on the college campus amongst students?
I'll tackle this one. Obviously, caffeine was spoken already. That seems to be the one that we use in between everything else, because it's somewhat mild or whatever. I would put likes and views up there just as high as other things, because of the reward, the shot of dopamine you get when you get a like, you get a view, you get a comment. Oh, it's such a good feeling, a warm, fuzzy feeling inside. And then it goes away pretty fast. Internet gaming, video games are used to cope and to calm. And I mean, I think to Mac's point, in initially sort of asking what you medicate with, we got to understand, like, that's used to take away the shame. We're not broken. God created pleasure for a reason. But we're choosing to shortcut that, and we're choosing to take advantage of that. I see it in Adderall, study drugs, Xanax, and then, students begin to sort of combat their highs and lows, and they have sort of a cocktail in their body trying to tinker back and forth with different feelings. Obviously in Oklahoma, particularly with the laws on use of cannabis changing, I've seen that more and more. Even shopping, some students are cope with success. Like, I have to get success, I have to get attention, I have to have experiences, I have to do something dangerous. There's all kinds of rewards like that.
We normalize so many of them. We call people adrenaline junkies. And I mean, that's addiction language, but it's okay if you're an adrenaline junkie. And, because supposedly you're only risking yourself. But I guess the one of the bigger ones that I would add, in growing up, I grew up in a kitchen. And for Christmas, what I want are new kitchen knives, because I do all the cooking in my family. Because for me, cooking is comfort, and again, it's like adrenaline junkie. We talk about comfort food. We spin it, but for some people, either overindulgence, or especially on the ladies' side, underindulgence in food, bulimia and those kinds of things. Food addictions are among.
Oh yeah.
So
It's huge.
yeah. So like one thing, and Matt, you began to get fairly explicit on this, but I think it's something we probably need to explore some. And this is kind of going off our script a little bit, but you mentioned we're not broken, right? Like, these things are good. God created pleasure, right? So sex is good, pornography is bad. Food is good, right? Take and eat, but food addiction's bad. How can one discern kind of when has a good thing become a bad thing, right? Like, the adrenaline is good sometimes, right? Like, doing something like that isn't a bad thing inherently, but when does it become bad, right? So how can one discern when it's becoming unhealthy in their life and it's becoming what we could possibly call an addiction?
Yeah, I would say when that thing becomes the end, in itself, and when someone spends just as much pleasure from the effort to go and obtain it, that's a sign that it's moving to the place of God. We're not praising God for rest or praising God for food. We're praising the food, I wrote down, and it's kind of lengthy, but there are 11 sort of symptoms that go along with addiction. And I'll just list some of them off real quick. Taking larger and larger amounts, that's a sign. Many attempts to cut down with no success. We talked about time obtaining it. When your day revolves around it, and when you crave it, you can't think of anything else. So we talk about being hangry, when that pursuit keeps you from answering a simple question, or completing a simple task that's right in front of you. When you begin to see it impair your job, your school, you've lost a relationship because of it, you begin to withdraw from hobbies or family, things that you typically like. And then one thing I think is key is, and Mac may have mentioned this, the risky use goes up. The places and situations, like he talked about doing it when you're all alone. I think about going to a really sketchy part of town or whatever. You're like, where were you? Why were you over here? That doesn't seem to impair someone's desire to obtain this. And so I kind of see it in those areas.
It's really important to identify those kinds of things because, I always joke, I have an addictive personality, and, if you could get addicted to apple pie, I would. Um, and so one of the dangers of this kind of podcast where we try to lay a foundation is it sounds like, everything is addiction prone. Well, for addicted people, yes. And so it really is important to define some of this, um, especially in the ones that you can't, um, you can't work around. I can avoid alcohol. There's none in my house. I don't spend significant time with people who drink. I don't. If I'm in that situation, I make sure people are aware that that's an issue for me, and I can put up barriers. But if you're dealing with food addiction or and I'm always joking. I got 99 problems, but pornography is not one, and I'm really grateful for that because how in the world do you get away from the sexual culture? It's part of life, and so it's really important that as people are listening to this, if they're asking, or diminishing what we're talking about, because it sounds like you can be addicted to everything. It's really important to go back and listen to what Matt just talked about.
Another,
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Ben. I think when you were talking, it made me think of just the easy yoke of Jesus. And how some people have addictive personalities. They love habits that makes them feel secure, that makes them feel stable. And I think God knew we were like that, and we can make that work for us in spiritual disciplines. And for someone like Mac, it's probably easier sometimes for you to do the Jesus thing because you practiced it, because it's common, it's known. And for some people getting out of addiction, the scariest thing is the unknown of not having it. Like they would try it, but it's unknown. But this other coping mechanism, it's so familiar, it's so comfortable, it's so known that it's just the path they go down.
Yeah. So, and I'm glad you said that because it kind of is going where I want to go, and because I kind of want to make another distinction that y'all brought out in a previous conversation, and that is that, right, this idea that we're all medicating with something, and really, in some ways, it's like, especially for someone who does have a more addictive personality, and I'm this way. I mean, I'm very obsessive. You're going to move from one coping mechanism to another, right? And in some ways, spiritual disciplines are like this coping mechanism for the, they're these crutches, right? That give us handles so that we can live a life in the way of Jesus, in the way of love. And so I guess could y'all maybe talk about and make distinctions between, and unpack this idea that moving out of addiction is really graduating into a better addiction of some sort, or a better coping mechanism?
Well, the language that Matt used in previous conversation that, when you're dealing with an addiction, you're traveling a well-worn pathway. You've mapped a neural network that you are so used to traveling down. It's muscle memory. And what we're talking about here is, we're not substituting one addiction for another. That's really dangerous. But we are talking about being willing to take the pathway that you're so used to. It's so comfortable. Addictions are addictions because they're comfortable. They make us feel at home. And I have to be careful even talking about mine long enough because it takes me into a mental space where I'm comfortable again, and I'm not going there. I'm not going to become a drinker again because of a podcast. And so, I'm not going to get back on that 4-lane highway. And I love Matt's imagery of we're so used to traveling down this highway. There are places to get off. We can map new pathways, but those are unknown exits. And it's really important to begin to identify, okay, if I'm on this particular pathway and I know I need to get off and I haven't been able to get off of it, that's addiction. Then, where are the exits? Where is the friend with the flashing sign saying exit here? where I can begin to explore new territory and map new pathways that are healthier. Because you can get addicted to religion, you can get addicted to orthodoxy, you can get addicted to, things that we tend to say are, especially in Christian circles, positive, and those become negative as well. So it's really important to begin to identify healthy places where you can step off that path.
Yeah, that's great. I think of and Mac, we didn't even talk about this one, and I'm sure you know of it, but that idea of the spirit and the flesh, and having two dogs inside of you fighting, which dog will win, the spirit or the flesh? And the chief says, the dog that you feed is the dog that will win. And I love the highway analogy because it makes me think of just how we have genes, even genes that are available for us that are dormant. And when we start a new behavior, it's there. We can unlock it, and we can feed it, and it will grow. And then these other, even if you have a genetic predisposition to addiction in your family, you can let that highway collapse, and it will. It's still there, but you stop feeding it, grass grows, and it's easier to travel down the more, we would say, the more adaptive pathway.
And especially when we're talking about college students who are listening to this, who are saying, I do have a problem, or I'm not sure if I do, but I'm asking those questions. I think the most important thing that they can hear right now is that you can get off of that highway. It takes time, it takes repetition. In AA, one of the most common statements I ever heard was relapse is part of recovery. That's not giving it permission, it's just taking away its power. When I was trying to stop drinking, for the first time, it didn't work. For the third time, it didn't work. When I got really serious about it and got involved in a community of people who were helping me get off of that highway, it still took multiple efforts. And so, people need to hear that you can map new highways, new pathways, new networks, unlock dormant genes, however we want to talk about it. That's probably an important segue into, how do you actually do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And before we jump into that, I guess there's one question I want to ask, and that is, why are these specific addictions that we've talked about, and why are these specific addictions that we talked about so common and prevalent on a college campus? And why is it just our propensity as humanity to do this, right? Like just to constantly just take on these unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with life and then turn them into addictions. Just why does this happen? And before we jump into how do we move forward? Because I think that's probably an important piece.
Yeah, Matt, why don't you jump on that one, Matt? Because my perspective is so personal that I really value yours.
Well, and I'm coming at it personally too, but
Yeah.
my answer would be, these things are incredibly efficient. They are. I can heat up my food with a microwave better than an oven, but who wants soggy bread? Or I can bring a gun to a knife fight and I can win, right? And so I think part of it is the efficiency of these chemicals or these behaviors. They don't appear to hurt anyone. They're hard to measure. They're hard to see. They're easy to hide, and they don't appear to have immediate consequences. Some of them do, right? But some of the other things don't. And so I think that, coupled with the fact of accessibility, and let's be honest, the college culture is set up for failure. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll probably talk about this in the next podcast, but what we see developmentally is college students some of them are just now coming out of adolescence, and they may still be in adolescence, a time where identity development is important. they are learning. You guys are maybe learning your limits, and the tension of adolescence is extreme idealism with the feeling of always being on stage, and mix within that the feeling of being invincible. So whenever daily life doesn't meet these narratives or this idealism, we're apt to figure out what Superman needs to get over the hump. And, we remove college students from parental support, from good boundaries, that they have been put in place that they've grown up with. And I think we could even be honest and say a lot of these behaviors started in high school. Like, just the same way someone might say, why do college students fall away in their faith? That's a funny one. It started in 5th grade, Mm-hmm. And one thing I'll tell students is, who you are today is who you will become. And a lot of times we see them tinkering around with different ways to cope, and it's a little bit dangerous to them. And then I think the last point I would make is, and I think this is a key one, your cognitive functioning, your executive functioning does not fully develop till you're 25. That ability to delay gratification, that ability to foresee consequences, it doesn't come till you're 25. So, I say it's you're still in your reptile brain.
Well, and it's, it really is, if we're going to get very basic about it, it's survival. And whether it's, earlier for some people, 5th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, into college, as you face uncertainty, as your paradigms begin to be shifted. And that's what's so critical about those college years. And it's not, if we looked at that, people who don't go to college in those same years, I suspect we're going to find the same thing. College just makes it, in some sense, it's that experience on steroids, because you are absolutely inundated with paradigm changing moments, whether it's a professor or a class or a textbook or a friend, or you see things you didn't think people actually did that only happens in the movies. Or it's just accepted now. If I hear one more person try to normalize their child's destructive behavior in their college years, because, well, that's what the college years are for. It just drives me crazy to hear that, because a lot of times it's just adults justifying their own stupidity when they're that age. And so everything about those years is set up for this. That's why it's, so common. And then the ones we've spoken of, they're just everywhere. Whether they're an accepted part of the culture, the drinking, the pornography, the food, all of these things. It's just not a surprise that those are the easiest shortcuts. I'm insecure. I'm uncomfortable. This is painful. I want to reach some mythical point in my life that I think other adults already have, where they're okay. And the idea that as you start to figure out that nobody's actually okay, we're all figuring this thing out. At 56, I'm realizing my dad, who's 83, still doesn't know everything. That's so disconcerting. And so we leap for these shortcuts. We feel better. We've arrived. At least we feel that way for a few minutes. And then, you start to map those networks, and boy, then you're in trouble.
Yeah, it makes me think of maybe an analogy is like the way that young people don't understand the value of money right away, right? And they begin to learn that everything has a cost. That carries in, I think, even to these shortcuts that still haven't fully realized that. What's the cost of that? Well, it's a good payoff. What's the cost? No idea. We'll find out.
Yeah. And just the language you were using there. It's not surprising that in a world of disorientation that we go to shortcuts for comfort, right? I mean, when you start thinking, it made a lot of sense. All right. Well, we've kind of talked about what the problem is. We've kind of tried to start probing at why, and we could talk for hours about that probably. But just to as we begin to round out this conversation, I want to talk about how do we move forward out of addiction. And sometimes it's moving forward, dealing with it, and then out. Right? It's not going to be a silver bullet. But what are maybe some first steps a college student could take? They're coming to the recognition that they're addicted. What are some first steps they can take? How do they begin to talk about this with a friend or a counselor or a mentor? What does that look like?
I don't think there's a single pathway that you can describe. It's slightly different for every person, but there are some principles that are ubiquitous. And I guess the first thing I would say is, and people need to hear this, there's got to be some people listening to this right now who are facing this and going, I've got a problem. What do I do? I think the first thing they need to hear is you are not alone in this. One of the most liberating things I ever found out when I walked into an AA meeting for the first time and saw people from every variation of life in that room. And, I really thought I was the most messed up person I knew. And I was alone in this, and there was no escape because mine was unique. Because part of what I was coping with was, I really wanted to be unique. I've got to be different. And finding out that it was okay to not be okay, that I wasn't some kind of freak, and that there was hope, there was a path, there were examples. And so people need to hear that from the very beginning. I don't care what you're dealing with. You are not alone. The two most powerful words in the English language. Me too. When you hear somebody else understand what you're going through and say, me too, you can get out. And so I think that's one of the first things that people need to hear is there is a way off of that highway.
Yeah. And that we talk about denial, like, I can't do it. I can't, and God can.
Yeah.
And God has a perfect process for this. And we may talk about what that part of that healing looks like. I think about driving a nail in and how hard it is to pull that nail out. It takes twice as long. And I think we talked about this previously, but in our preparation, but taking away that shame, I think part of seeing someone else struggle, hear your struggle in an environment of trust and still look you in the eye and accept you. I think having a little bit of good, healthy peer pressure, which is probably what got you into your coping mechanism, seeing traction in others, hearing what authentic, specific confession looks like. And that's why I like Celebrate Recovery. There are many different issues, but once everyone gets past their issue and down to the function of their addiction, the function is the same usually. And it makes people see those with Christian sins are just the same as those with unchristian sin.
That's really, really important. Because you're right, we categorize those things, especially if, folks are listening to this through a Christian lens, which is the nature of this podcast series. It's it all goes back to what James says, that I named my son James because of how high regard I have for the words of James. They're so pragmatic, where he says, confess your sins one to another. And if the people listening to this are at that step where they're going, you've got a gift of desperation. I've got to get out of this. I've got to have help. You've got to find a group of people who can walk through this with you. And as James says, confess your sins one to another so that you may be healed. The shame needs to go away. We're already forgiven. God's got this. It's the healing part that begins in large part when we start to address these things with others who can walk with us through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of removing that shame is not necessarily fighting directly against this issue, but saying, hey, you know what, this pornography or this alcoholism or this, it's been a okay friend for a little while, but it's time to say farewell. Like, you were able to help me through some things, but you are no longer able to help me in my adult life. And so goodbye. We had a short run, and now where's my identity? Like you mentioned, removing something must be replaced with something. And that replacement, to me, should line up with our identity as children of God. I am no longer known as a recovering addict. And my whole life, I won't be known by what I used to struggle with. I'm going to be known by what God is leading me into, his child, and, my role in his kingdom.
And that is such a powerful statement, Matt. When I got sober through AA. I worked that program. And boy, it works if you work it, and you can.
It's worth it.
There it is. But at some point, I had to say, wait a minute, my primary self-definition, once I had mapped enough time off of the highway in what looked like the wilderness of life, and I would begin to travel in those backwoods roads of real life, not addiction. My primary self-definition was no longer as a recovering alcoholic. Yeah, I am, but my primary self-definition is as a follower of Jesus, and so that language you used is so incredibly important. And in fact, now, as this podcast is evidence, God has never ceased to leverage my past for His kingdom's future. And there are no shortcuts to that. You work through that on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. And the shortened version that I've heard is God never wastes a hurt.
Oh, true.
It's the same idea. Do you think moving to how to walk beside someone is useful at this point, or we still want to unpack some more solutions for individuals?
Due to time, we probably will not get to engage that. And the one kind of last question, it is two parts, that I do want to ask y'all is this. One thing that I've noticed is confession. Just as someone begins to recognize and then they confess, and then there's this you kind of if you're on a podcast, my hand's going up, you're like reaching the hill, right? And you feel like you're peaking, and you're doing better, and then you end up still falling back into whatever addiction you have, right? And it gets hard again, and then the shame and guilt come back. Like that's just a cycle I've seen happen a lot.
Yep.
And have experienced. Right, and both of you talked about this, right? It's confess and be healed. It's remove and replace. So, like, what does it look like to go beyond confession and enter into the nitty-gritty journey of healing and replacing our addictions with things that are life-giving? And the second part to that question is, because we're not, this is just the beginning of a conversation that we are having, and that if you're a student listening to this, you're going to have to continue somehow. So what are some resources you would maybe point them towards if they're looking for some resources beyond this conversation?
There are a ton of healthy resources out there. If you're dealing with alcohol, AA, with other illicit drugs, NA, Celebrate Recovery's incredible. Matt can speak to that. But unless you're willing to walk into that kind of broader circumstance, and that's usually a step along the path, it's usually not the first step. I would encourage folks who are struggling with this, find a friend who you trust, and Ben, put my phone number on there. They can call me. you got to find somebody who can listen without judging, who can let you unburden it, who can let you take the power away from it by speaking it. Um, that's really important step. But then if you really want to stay clean, there's a principle involved too that says you got to change your people, your places, and your things. Um, and I wish we had a part 2 of this podcast, because this is where it just starts to get real. Because you sacrificed a lot to get your addiction. You're going to have to sacrifice a lot to get rid of it. You've got to change your people, your places, and your things. And for some people, that's quite literal. You've got to change schools. You got to leave school. You've got to get out of that class. You've got to leave a friendship alone. For me, I had to change jobs, and those things take time. But you couple that. You've got to start changing your people, your places, and your things, along with just be aware of what triggers you. And Matt, if you'll share the larger acronym, because I thought that was really powerful too. But for me, it's the word HALT, HALT. When you get hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, those things trigger you. We joke about the hangry, but it's so true. People become things they are not when they are hungry. And so you've got to eat regularly and exercise regularly and sleep well. And you may need medical help to be able to do that. And it looks different for different people. But if you can get off of that highway and not allow the things that trigger you to throw you back unthinkingly on it, then there's a chance for success.
Yeah. I mean, you got to get that initial distance, that initial sobriety, so that you can think clearly. We see that in every form of therapy. Like, before we can do any work, even to get down below the cause of this coping mechanism, we got to get stable. And to me, what separates a Christian from a non-Christian is not perfection, but it is that perfect process to deal with sin. And no longer is it just a one-time confession. It's ongoing, specific confession. And I'm a sports guy, so I like the language of we use sponsors and partners, but in the sports world, you need a coach and you need a teammate. Somebody in the trenches fighting right alongside you, who you call at 2 a.m. and say, this is where I am, come get me. And you need a coach to go eat breakfast with the next morning to go over the game film. Why was this such a trap for you? What were you running from? Were you disappointed? Were you hurting, exhausted, resentful, angry, tired? And, without that coach and that teammate, it's going to be really, really, really hard for you, because to me, as soon as you go back into denial, you're going back to that's the true relapse, not the behavior. The behavior is not the enemy. It's that shame from the relapse. That's the real enemy. It's that, and then, for me, and I don't know about for you, Mac, but when you run towards something and when you start to see distance, I start working on my character flaws. They're not like sins, but they're things I want to work on, and I'm targeting something new, and I'm no longer targeting that, that addiction, but I'm working on humility. This is where the fruits of the Spirit come in. I'm going to go through 9 months working on gentleness,
You couldn't speak greater truth. I'm 29 years clean, and I'm not worried about drinking today. What I am worried about is, am I open to the voice of the Spirit in my life, leading me on a daily basis? What are the things that prevent me from hearing the voice of God in my life? We serve an interventionist, redemptive God. And what's in my way today? And so you're right. I'm not consumed by trying to avoid my alcohol addiction anymore. Some days are worse than others, but I recognize those triggers much, much earlier, and so it is a process.
Well, we are running out of time, and I just want to thank you both so much. And this has been good for me, and I know it's going to be good for the students that get to listen to this. And I always love it in podcasts when I get people outside the ministry praying for the ministry. And due to time, I will only ask one of you. And since I made fun of your age earlier, Mac, I'll ask you to pray us out.
Yeah, I will. Let me say one last thing. And that's for those who are listening who've got a friend who's got this issue. It's not them, but they're being called to be the person, or they think they are, who's going to walk alongside the teammate. Be careful. And I don't mean that you would fall into it. I hope we're wise enough to avoid that. But what people need to hear when they're being called to walk alongside that is their sobriety, their cleanliness, however you want to use it. That's not your responsibility. If you're not stable and steady, you're no good to anybody. And so don't get enmeshed, to use that language. It's not your responsibility. Matt, you want to address that real quick before I pray?
Oh, I would just say that you can't force somebody to hit a rock bottom. And, Mac, I loved your definition. Like, they're going down a slide and you're showing up in windows saying, you can do it. This is not who you are. See you at the bottom, man. You can't force that. I would say celebrate their success, help them keep their head up. Don't for a second, with all of our struggles, the way that we see the first person look at us when we have told them that we struggle in any area, that is a chance for a trauma moment. And we have to be able to look at them and say those, me too. Share your struggle with them. If you're walking alongside them, you gotta share your junk too, or you're not going to be effective. So
just keep showing up. Keep showing up. If you've got a friend who's just descending that slide thinking there's no cheese grater at the bottom, it's 2020. It's all cheese graters. And keep showing up in the window over and over and over. And you're right. Transparency and vulnerability is the key, but you're not responsible for their addiction recovery. All right, we could go on forever.
Dependency, right?
That's right. All right, let me pray. And Ben, I'm serious. If you want to put my phone number out there, I'm a non-local resource, which sometimes is what you need. Somebody who doesn't have a clue who you are, and they're okay with that. Let me pray. Father God, you're so good. And the voice of your Spirit speaks even now in a timeless fashion. Whenever this is heard or seen, we ask, Father, that your Spirit would continue to move not only in the people who are hearing this and saying, I've got a problem, but the people that you're calling to be the teammate and the coach. I pray for Matt and Ben as they continue to be your shepherds among the flock. Father, I pray for your church worldwide, that we would embrace our role, that we're supposed to actually have answers, and that we would be people in the trenches who are vulnerable and transparent. And above all, Father, I ask that you help us to have ears to hear the voice of your Spirit. And for those particular people who are hearing this right now and weeping in the midst of their addiction, we ask for healing and hope, and that you would empower those who are going to listen and not judge, and just love without end. And we look forward to one day spending eternity hearing how you have resurrected people to life. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.